The second lesson for the morning comes on the heels of last Sunday's piece of Matthew's story. Last Sunday, Jesus was baptized in the Jordan, and when he had come up from the waters, a voice was heard to say, "This is my son, my beloved, listen to him." This story that we're about to hear is usually read on Ash Wednesday, as we begin the period of Lent, which is 40 days plus Sundays prior to Easter. So it's entirely possible you'll hear this story again in just a few weeks. But this story picks up the narrative, and we're moving now with Jesus into a time of temptation. Then Jesus was led up by the Spirit into the wilderness to be tempted by the devil. He fasted 40 days and 40 nights, and afterwards he was famished. The tempter came and said to him, "If you are the Son of God, command these stones to become loaves of bread." But Jesus answered, "It is written, one does not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds from the mouth of God." Then the devil took him to a holy city and placed him on the pinnacle of the temple, saying to him, "If you are the Son of God, throw yourself down. For it is written, he will command his angels concerning you, and on their hands they will bear you up so that you will not dash your foot against a stone." Jesus said to him, "Again it is written, do not put the Lord your God to the test." Again the devil took him to a very high mountain and showed him all the kingdoms of the world and their splendor. And he said to Jesus, "All these I will give you, if you will fall down and worship me." Jesus said to him, "Away with you, Satan, for it is written, worship the Lord your God, and serve only him." Then the devil left him, and suddenly angels came and waited on him. Glory be to God who gives us the word. May God write that word on our hearts, and may God and God alone receive glory, honor, and praise. The great 20th century theologian Archie Bunker once defined faith as, quote, "something that no one in their right mind would ever believe." Those words came back to me this week as I wrestled with the story of Jesus' temptation. There is so much about this story that stretches the bounds of credibility. If, like me, you've been around the church for a while, you've heard this story presented as history, as biography, as factual data. That's how I heard it for a very long time. The wilderness, for example, sounded like pre-pioneer Indiana, where it was said a squirrel could run across the state without its feet ever touching the ground. The wilderness sounded like forests and underbrush, with people hacking their way through with machetes. Then I went to Israel. It couldn't have been less of what I had imagined. The wilderness was sand, rocks, and very little else. The wilderness was desolation, bleakness, an arid, inhospitable place inhabited by scorpions and snakes. An Indiana squirrel wouldn't last there a day. And then there's the whole 40 days piece of the puzzle. 40 pops up a lot around the Bible, and rarely in a good way. 40 days of rain as the flood covered the earth. 40 years of Israel wandering through the wilderness. Oh, there's the wilderness again. Jesus in the wilderness fasting for 40 days and night. Not much of a connection with Noah, but what a connection with the story of Israel being led throughout the wilderness, facing times of testing and trial, all to discover what it means to be God's people. 40 days and nights of fasting to discover what it means to be God's person. That's pretty good. Maybe these stories challenge us because we read them too literally. Maybe the best way to come at these stories of Jesus, particularly in the Gospel of Matthew, is by reading them symbolically and metaphorically. The ancient rabbis had a genre called Mishnah. Jesus taught in parables, as we will see throughout the weeks of February and March. What if we viewed this very unusual story through the lens of parable? For reasons he can't explain other than a feeling, a prodding, a leading, Jesus goes into the wilderness and enters into the ancient spiritual discipline of fasting. Fasting has often been a spiritual method for discerning God's direction, God's purpose. Jesus fasted for a long time, a time that prepared him to face extraordinarily important questions, questions designed to clarify his identity, his purpose, his calling. There he is in the wilderness, in this time of discovery, a spirit quest, a holy moment. Presumably when he was weakened and opened to the power of suggestion, the ideas and the images began to emerge. The gospel speaks of the devil and the tempter. This is evil given personification. This is the presence of a way of God that is not God's way. This is the powers and pressures that often lead us away from being who God created us to be. Both Matthew and Luke tell us that Jesus faced 3 temptations, even if they offer them in different order. The round rocks of the wilderness, of which there are millions, look like loaves of bread. Command these stones to become loaves of bread. After 40 days and 40 nights without bread, the idea of bread must have sounded pretty good. Have a nibble, the voice says. What could it hurt? Then Jesus sees himself on the highest point of the temple, overlooking the temple courts and the Kidron Valley beyond. Jump off, the voice says, and let everyone see the angels of God catch you. Put on a little show, a little demonstration of who you are and what God will do for you. What could it hurt? Finally, Jesus imagines himself at a very high spot and laid out like a rug before him are all the kingdoms of the world, a feasible idea when you don't know the earth is round. If you abandon this thing you've got going with God, the voice says, you can have it all. A little compromise, and the world can be yours. What could it hurt? Now, Matthew churches it up a bit and has Jesus respond by quoting scripture verses back to the voice, but that's just a stained glass way of saying that Jesus didn't give in. The voice of temptation was not as strong as that voice that was heard at Jesus' baptism that proclaimed, "This is my Son, the beloved, with whom I am well pleased." I can tell you as a parent that if that voice was pleased at the time of the baptism, it was even more pleased at the end of the trial and temptation. Who Jesus was had been put to the test, and he passed with flying colors. When you start poking around some of the lesser-known books of the New Testament, you sometimes find a little passage or a verse that sticks with you, just jumps off the page. One such verse came back to me as I thought about this story. You find it in the letter to the Hebrews. In the 4th chapter, the 15th verse, we read, "For we do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with us in our weakness, but we have one who in every respect has been tested as we are, yet without sin." Jesus, our high priest in the language of the letter to the Hebrews, was tempted and tried in every way that you and I are tempted and tried. The only difference is that Jesus did not yield to the voice that called him to walk a way that was not God's way. Jesus withstood making all the wrong choices. Jesus was able to stay God's person through it all. That doesn't have anything to do with Jesus' divinity. Jesus couldn't cave in to the trial or the test because he was God. That's what my Sunday school teachers told me. They were wrong. This story has everything to do with Jesus' humanity. Being fully human, he could have responded to the voice inviting him to turn stones into bread. Being fully human, he could have put on a religious display for those near the temple. Being fully human, he could have answered the invitation to power. It is precisely because Jesus was fully human that this story is told. It is because Jesus is fully human, just like the rest of us, that we recount Jesus ignoring the invitation to walk away from God's path and remaining fatally faithful to God. Which means we need to learn the lesson Jesus lived. The temptation to self-satisfaction is ever before us. Have you ever noticed that the moment you commit to watching what you eat, you find yourself in situations where the most luscious foods are available? Have you ever noticed that when you make the decision to give up television for a while, there's always that program you would really enjoy? Have you ever noticed that when you're speaking in public, the need to cough becomes more real? That one's for me. Meeting our own desires, wants, and needs keeps us from even recognizing the genuine needs of others. While we muse over which restaurant in which we will choose to dine, we fail to even think about the hungry and how what we overspend on ourselves might be better used to feed those without food. In our lives of excess and overindulgence, we fail to meet the challenge of being God's people and loving our neighbor as ourselves. In our immoderation with matters financial, in our intemperance surrounding possessions and belongings, in our pursuit of instant gratification, it is so easy to forget that the way of discipleship, the pathway of living as God's people, is hard, challenging, difficult. And so we do exactly what we want to do exactly because we can. When tempted to think of ourselves first, we often answer yes to that invitation. When tempted to put God to the test, we will sometimes ease our conscience by saying, if God wants that to happen, it's up to God. I will take no responsibility. I will take no action. I will not accept any blame or accountability. I'll leave it up to God. Think of the foxhole deal. We're in the worst predicament we can imagine, more often than not of our own making, and we cry out to God, if you just get me out of this one, I promise I will. There's more than a little desperation there, but there's also more than a little of putting God to the test there as well. I don't wear a seatbelt because God will take care of me. What? I won't study for that test because God will give me the answers I need. Good luck with that one. I'm not going to make any move toward rectifying that situation because God will put things right. When coaxed into amassing power for ourselves of any kind, we feel the nudge. If I just compromise on my core connection to God and the gospel, I can really be somebody. If I just swallow my pride and give in a little, I can look a little better in the eyes of all. If I cut a few corners, take something that no one will notice, climb down off my moral high horse, I can have this or I can be that. More often than not, that means abandoning God's way, drying off the waters of our baptism, and learning to say with Peter, the fisherman disciple, Jesus, never heard of him. Times of trial and testing our mettle as God's people come with amazing regularity. Opportunities to walk away from the promises we have made to God and to ourselves follow the course of the sun and the moon across the skies. The good news is we are stronger than we realize. If Jesus was tempted in every way that we are and could stay faithful, we can stay faithful too. The same power that sustained Jesus in the wilderness sustains us in the wilderness of our world. The same power that enabled Jesus to endure is with us and can empower our endurance. The same presence that accompanied Jesus through his wilderness journey is with us on our expedition through life. And when we fail, and we will, when we succumb to the enticing voice that will lead us in a direction other than God's, and we will, there is mercy and grace. Taken together, the 15th and 16th verses of the 4th chapter of the letter to the Hebrews tells us, "For we do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with us in our weakness, but we have one who in every respect has been tempted as we are, yet without sin. Let us therefore approach the throne of grace with boldness, so that we may receive mercy and find grace to help in every time of need." It's about the choices we make. Choices have consequences. Some good, some not so good. The well-worn maxim tells us that life is the result of the choices we make. I'll tell you this: discipleship is the result of the voices we choose to follow. That being said, choose wisely, for now and evermore. Amen.